gentleman found himself ensnared within a canvas. Time flowed in an entirely distinct manner within this artistic realm. 1 week indoors equated to 30 years in the external realm. Additionally, more remarkable, he had an extraordinary talent. Whatever he sketched would materialize. If his residence required a tea service, he could effortlessly summon one into being. If he experienced solitude, he could illustrate a unicorn to provide him with companionship. He believed he would inhabit the artwork for all time. However, what transpired next took him entirely by surprise. The artwork was abruptly presented for bidding, and its new proprietor unearthed that he was residing within it. To comprehend how this transpired, the narrative traces back 3 decades to a blaze at Saggio's educational institution. While everyone else was frantically attempting to flee, Go charged directly into the inferno. He made his way to the art studio, concluding that if fleeing was futile, he would prefer to perish alongside his own artwork. However, at that instant, the artwork unexpectedly emitted a radiant glow. When Go reopened his eyes once more, he discovered himself within the realm he had illustrated. He could solely fret about whether the youngsters had managed to flee unharmed. A week quickly elapsed and Go came to understand that all aspects of this realm were peculiar. The hairs in this area possessed 3 ocular organs, and even the passage of time seemed peculiar. That was the reason Go was unaware of how much time had elapsed beyond those solitary days. Nonetheless, he had already deciphered several fundamental principles of this artistic realm. The initial principle was that whatever he sketched would materialize. With a delicate caress, an apple would plummet directly from the canvas. If he sketched a pouch of salt, an actual pouch of salt would manifest. Go utilized this capability to generate provisions, nourishment, flora, and all other essentials required for his survival. However, his talent had one evident constraint. He was incapable of generating human beings. Even if he sketched an individual, it would merely transform into a warm, inert form that could never exhibit motion like a genuine person. Go felt a sense of relief. At the very least, he had not acquired a dreadful ability that could obliterate his tranquil existence. The second guideline stated that he could engage with the external environment through the framework leaning against the tree. He might even abandon the artwork altogether. Go once ventured outdoors and realized that 31 years had elapsed, resulting in a world that was entirely altered. Individuals possessing remarkable abilities emerged around the globe, accompanied by an array of formidable creatures. These extraordinary warriors were compelled to jeopardize their lives confronting the beasts on a daily basis. Go lacked faith in his ability to endure in such a perilous time, concluding that the external environment was merely too hazardous. Thus, he went back to the artwork and persisted in leading his serene existence. The third principle was that the woodland had the capacity to produce a self-sustaining ecosystem independently. Go had merely depicted a 2-story cottage and a woodland, without meticulously incorporating each flora or nuance of the landscape. However, once he stepped into the artwork, all those particulars materialized spontaneously. The being within the artwork was remarkably amiable towards him. Even the avians exhibited no trepidation and joyfully perched upon his shoulders. Go speculated it was due to his role as the architect of this realm. Given that these beings had emerged from his creation, it was logical for them to have faith in their originator. The fourth guideline was notably more peculiar, as a status display abruptly manifested before Go. The window suddenly appeared from thin air and nearly gave him a fright. However, this was not precisely a regulation of the illustrated woodland. It was a phenomenon frequently encountered by individuals who stirred from slumber following the great cataclysm, referred to as hunters. It resembled a video game, and in some way, Go had transformed into a conscious tracker too. Within the artwork, though, it seemed more akin to a soothing pastime centered on collecting components and preparing meals. Go was uncertain whether these skills would prove advantageous in the future, yet he resolved to experiment with creating using the resources he had amassed that day. At the very minimum, it provided him with something novel to appreciate amidst his tranquil existence. Go was unemployed, thus all he engaged in was dining and resting. For midday repast that day, he crafted sweet potatoes coated in honey. His lodge was perpetually supplied with impeccably fresh components. He could at last savor the tranquil existence he had longed for. During his time as an educator, he was so occupied that a solitary meal could consume up to 3 hours of his time. At that moment, Go unexpectedly caught sounds emanating from beyond the confines of the frame. His inquisitiveness was promptly awakened, guiding him toward the ultimate principle of this realm: The artwork he had previously selected as the location where he would take his final breath had now entirely transformed. Go himself had transformed into the focal point of the artwork. The piece was now named Portrait of Cog. Go gradually emerged through the opening, yet it seemed as if some sort of creature had just traversed the vicinity. Perceiving a threat, he promptly resolved to withdraw into the artwork. Go had long embraced the artistic realm as his private refuge, and he sincerely cherished residing there. In this realm, he possessed nothing but infinite time, and all the liberty he desired to prepare anything he pleased. This tranquil existence had entirely enchanted him, instilling no yearning to venture beyond. At that moment, he perceived an additional voice. Indeed, this is the moment. All around was obliterated in the blaze, yet this artwork remained entirely unscathed. The unfamiliar individual accessed his interface display and scrutinized the piece of art. He found that it was named Portrait of Cog. The outsider possessed an evaluation talent, and his team had arrived here in pursuit of uncommon valuables. He surmised that the artwork must have been retrieved from some form of subterranean chamber. The two gentlemen promptly carried the artwork away, certain that aficionados would be ecstatic about it, and that they had at last discovered their route to wealth. Thus, Go was transported from the remnants without ever becoming aware of it. Go was still relishing his tranquil existence within the artwork, entirely oblivious to the events unfolding beyond, as the landscape outside the borders continued to transform. By the time he became aware of it, the artwork had already surfaced at an auction. The enigmatic piece swiftly became the focus of an intense bidding battle, with purchasers presenting remarkable sums of money. However, each proposal was swiftly overwhelmed by an even greater bid. Following a vigorous bidding war, the artwork was ultimately transported to a collector's exclusive gallery. The exhibition was brimming with numerous unique and precious relics. A depiction of Cog was positioned on one of its exhibition panels. The connoisseur gazed at the masterpiece with delight, deeming it truly splendid. He was not only an S-tier hunter according to the appraisal scale, but also the leader of the Collector Guild. 3 hours prior, one of his subordinates had inquired if Collector was truly a fitting designation for their guild. The individual simply lifted a digit. "Are you suggesting to me, the gatherer, that I ought to cease my collecting pursuits?" What a slight! A genuine connoisseur must engrave the very essence of collecting into his marrow. The subordinate remained displeased because the artwork had drained their finances significantly. However, that sum was merely trivial expenditure to the collector. Moreover, what was amiss with utilizing his personal finances for something he desired? Before the underling could contest any further, the collector interjected, disclosing that even the president of the Hunter Association had coveted the artwork. 3 decades and 1 year ago, a monumental catastrophe occurred as innumerable realms collided with the Earth, resulting in the formation of dungeons throughout the globe. Creatures surged through portals of different dimensions, although the manifestation and interference of deities resulted in widespread ruin on Earth. Mankind persisted solely due to the emergence of the system. This artwork, which remained unscathed by the calamity, transformed into one of its emblems of perpetuity. The head of the Hunter Association had never amassed artwork and was solely focused on cultivating monsters, yet even he had proposed 200 billion won for the painting. The bespectacled aide was astonished that someone would invest such a ridiculous sum on a solitary piece of art. Nevertheless, when the curator directly utilized evaluation on the artwork, he was unable to acquire any details regarding it. The subordinate promptly expressed remorse. "I was too uninformed to acknowledge its genuine worth and assessed it without comprehending anything. I genuinely regret, however." The reality was that even the curator was unaware of the artwork's significance. He had merely experienced an irresistible urge that compelled him to acquire it. However, the glasses-wearing subordinate's demeanor swiftly soured. "Guild leader, what precisely do you imply? Are you toying with me in some manner? You attained S-rank hunter status solely through your evaluation ability, and you head the Collector Guild, one of the 3 principal guilds in Korea. However, even an individual such as yourself is unable to recognize this object. If such a phenomenon genuinely exists, what impact could it have on the planet? The guildmaster erupted in laughter. Are you praising me or merely being obsequious? Yet the subordinate had unmistakably been ironic. In the following moment, the guildmaster showcased an enthusiastic grin. Then I'll share the reality. This artwork is more perilous than anything we have ever acquired. Those. The utterance swiftly triggered a chill sweat to cascade down the subordinate's brow. Indeed, the guildmaster was completely unaware of the identity of the individual depicted in the artwork. Should the artwork have been fashioned by human hands, its artistry was nothing short of extraordinary. However, even in the absence of human creation, it remained equally astonishing. The guildmaster could perceive an extraordinary vitality within the artwork, as if a genuine living being had been imprisoned within it. At that moment, Gio's gaze abruptly shifted within the artwork, and he looked straight at the guildmaster. The guildmaster's students narrowed their eyes as his whole form became immobilized. His sight abruptly faded to black, as though an infinite void had engulfed him entirely, rendering him incapable of comprehending the situation. Amidst that utter obscurity, merely a set of profound, vividly hued eyes persisted. Those eyes appeared to encompass an entire cosmos, and cosmic was the sole term the guildmaster could employ to characterize them. A short while later, Gio shut his eyes within the artwork. Yet the guildmaster stood paralyzed, incapable of regaining composure after what he had observed. He sensed as if his spirit had been uplifted. How could a creation that even his evaluative abilities failed to grasp be considered a commonplace likeness? Having observed such a magnum opus with his own gaze, he could now depart without remorse. In the meantime, Gio had also observed the individual positioned outside the artwork. Terror swiftly engulfed him, as the man appeared to have unearthed his presence. Even more perplexing, why had the landscape beyond the borders transformed so profoundly? What had become of the corridor from earlier? Gio had never anticipated feeling endangered while residing in his tranquil lodge. Even less did he foresee someone from the external realm uncovering his presence. The guildmaster softly tapped on the doorframe. "Pardon me, is there anyone inside?" "Sir, can you perceive my voice? Would you be inclined to engage in conversation with me?" Gio was at a loss for words. He harbored no inclination to converse with such a perilous individual. After surveying his environment, Gio discovered that he had been brought into an exceptionally opulent structure. Based on the meticulously crafted decor, this seemed to be a personal gallery cherished by its proprietor. This resulted in a significant issue, as the frame was Gio's sole access to the external environment. If he abandoned the artwork from this point forward, would he, in effect, be infringing upon property rights each and every instance? Even more troubling, what if they concluded the painting was possessed and incinerated it? The idea caused Gio to mourn his misfortune. The exterior realm was just too harsh. When the individual within the artwork declined to reply, the guildmaster understood that he may have been excessively direct. The man evidently was not prepared to engage in conversation with him. Thus, he lowered his tone. "Kindly don't feel obligated. I will return tomorrow." Based on his demeanor, the individual appeared to be a decent person. Nevertheless, Gio remained apprehensive. Regardless of how terrified he felt, he still required nourishment. The blossoms and fruits he had collected previously had dehydrated flawlessly. Thus, he resolved to prepare some floral tea and savor the berries as a sweet conclusion. However, just as he was on the verge of starting, he recalled that he lacked a tea service. In that scenario, he would merely create one for himself. Gio stepped into his studio and commenced meticulously sketching the tea service. Soon, a refined teapot materialized before him. Gio clutched it to his chest as if he had acquired an invaluable gem. He subsequently poured himself a cup of steaming tea with great ease. Gio genuinely fit within this tranquil realm where he could relish a serene and soothing existence. For him, this life was entirely ideal. At that moment, the system notified Gio that tea made from bibanical petals had potent hemostatic and immunity-enhancing properties. Regrettably, he lacked any means to assess those impacts personally. Since he plunged into the artwork, every innate physiological process he previously had vanished entirely. Gio was still able to consume food and rest, yet he no longer sensed warmth or chill. Furthermore, regardless of how fatigued he grew, he never perspired. What's even more impressive is that he never had to utilize the restroom. He had simply descended into a canvas, yet somehow transformed into an elevated entity. In other terms, he would never again need to scrub a commode. However, the genuine issue lay with the guildmaster beyond the confines of the picture. Precisely as Geo anticipated, the individual had come back to converse with him once more. Geo deemed the whole scenario draining. He experienced social anxiety and harbored no inclination to converse with an unfamiliar individual. The gentleman had called upon him for 11 successive days, arriving joyfully on each occasion. Yet Geo was a despondent recluse who lacked the faintest notion of how to engage in dialogue. All he longed for was the return of his tranquil and serene seclusion. His intuition suggested that the guild leader likely bore him no ill will. Geo admired the individual's fervor. However, the guildmaster was fervently eager to converse with him and persistently implored for a reply. The guild leader had even seized a living individual to serve as an offering. After all, enigmatic artifacts and tales typically necessitated a human tribute for activation. He was convinced this strategy was infallible, as discovering a genuinely nefarious offender was remarkably simple in this age. The guild leader addressed with sincerity, "If there is a specific transgressor you wish to apprehend, I can secure them without delay. Whether you need an object, an agreement, or any other stipulation, simply request it." Yet Geo continued to remain silent. He understood that once he uttered a word, he would likely never experience another tranquil moment. Thus, he disregarded the gentleman and resumed sipping his tea. Based on what Geo had picked up from the conversation outside, this individual seemed to be at the helm of one of Korea's 3 prominent guilds. The guild leader exhaled in frustration. Despite the passage of numerous days, the individual within the artwork continued to remain silent. He silently gazed at the exquisite and almost perfect masterpiece. At last he remarked, "Until we reconvene." With that, the guild leader pivoted and exited the hall. Geo had never perceived any animosity from him, and the individual did not appear malevolent. Thus, Geo held no aversion towards him. However, managing interactions with him was mentally draining, and this circumstance could not persist indefinitely. The guild leader had departed earlier than normal that day. When his tolerance finally depleted, Geo could potentially encounter a catastrophe. This was the reason Geo chose to reach out to an external individual. If they determined that the artwork was entirely inert and opted to incinerate it like a commonplace portrait, it would all come to an end. Geo was uncertain if he would persist should the painting be obliterated, or if the complete illustrated realm would disintegrate alongside it. He had no desire to be executed by fire, so he had to reclaim authority over his sole access to the external world. At that moment, the hourglass that Geo had set up ultimately depleted. Simultaneously, a personnel member entered the exhibition space. She meticulously monitored the temperature and moisture levels across the entire space. Her concluding assignment was to examine the painting. However, when she gazed upward, the figure within the artwork had vanished. The unimaginable spectacle instantly filled her with dread. At that moment, she noticed an extraordinarily subtle sound of footsteps trailing behind her. Perceiving an individual nearing from the rear, her heartbeat started to race uncontrollably. She abruptly whirled around, merely to discover that there was entirely no one present. Then, Geo's voice gradually emerged from below. "Hello, I'm down here. Would you like to converse? I would be delighted to engage in a discussion with you." As he spoke, Geo presented her with a handcrafted cookie as a warm gesture to initiate their conversation. However, the employee was so frightened that all the items she was holding tumbled to the ground. The Collector Guild stood as one of the 3 principal guilds in Korea. The entire collection was owned by a single individual, the S-rank hunter by Sable. Nonetheless, patrons keen on acquiring art were permitted to access and explore the gallery. At that moment, a silver-haired gentleman made his entrance into the gallery. He had arrived to explore the allegations that the gallery was spectral. During the previous fortnight, the guild had accumulated a cumulative total of 17 first-hand accounts. Their guild leader amassed anything that could be regarded as art. He was unfazed even if the creation itself proved to be a monstrosity. However, a fortnight prior, unusual events had started taking place across the exhibition space. The elderly gentleman with silver hair appeared to be be rather unfazed by the prospect of a specter. The Human Resources Division had successfully curtailed the dissemination of gossip beyond its confines, and given that the occurrences were still fairly trivial, managing the information had been straightforward. However, they could not maintain secrecy indefinitely, which resulted in a significant headache for the silver-haired gentleman. He inquired specifically about their preferred approach to managing the predicament. This individual was Ryu Sung-un, an S-rank hunter. The individual who had extended the invitation was convinced that Sung-un was exceptionally trustworthy. He earnestly wished for Sung-un to accept the role of Chief Administrative Officer, particularly since Sung-un had previously headed a research division within the Hunter Association. However, that very background had sparked significant debate upon his departure from the association. Sung-un ultimately declined the role as he had no inclination to draw public scrutiny once more. The official refocused on the primary concern. Speculations of a specter within the gallery were profoundly harmful to the structure, necessitating Sung-un to devise protective strategies. He subsequently provided Sung-un with all the accessible paperwork. These are the accounts from witnesses. Commencing next week, we intend to offer supplementary training for the personnel. The apparition stands roughly 6 feet in height, possesses a robust physique, has dark hair, fair skin, and wears a black cape. The aspect that made the most significant impact on each observer was the ghost's astonishingly attractive appearance. Regarding its evident capabilities, observers experienced considerable difficulty in establishing eye contact with him or gazing directly at his visage. Nevertheless, they all fervently maintained that he was attractive. He approached silently, and throughout discussions, nothing could be perceived apart from his tone. Numerous individuals had previously encountered the apparition, and astonishingly, each account depicted almost identical details. For an enigmatic creature allegedly lurking within the gallery, it appeared disinterested in shrouding its presence. Sung-un deemed the circumstance highly peculiar. The apparition manifested often, yet no individual had sustained injuries or perished. No creature on Earth had ever proven to be benign towards humanity. Almost every being that surfaced from a dungeon exhibited outright animosity. If a genuinely innocuous creature emerged, it would swiftly dominate headlines worldwide. Prior to the public uncovering it, the Hunter Association would probably confine it indefinitely as a subject for investigation. However, the aspect that perplexed Sung-un the most was the specter's tendency to bestow gifts upon individuals. Upon initially meeting the apparition, the employee courteously requested her to converse with him and conducted himself as an entirely ordinary individual. He ultimately proposed that they swap names. Despite the employee being too intimidated to meet his gaze, the apparition persisted in conversing with calmness, and their dialogue remained entirely mundane. He never inquired into excessively intimate matters, and whenever an individual faltered in their response, he refrained from pursuing the issue further. Most perplexingly of all, the specter bestowed a present upon each observer following the conclusion of their dialogue. Sung-un could scarcely fathom what he was perusing. The accounts appeared utterly ludicrous. The specter's offerings were merely commonplace sustenance that anyone could identify. Confronted with such an extraordinary circumstance, even Sung-un was uncertain about how to react. The guild master had formerly employed numerous inmates to evaluate the sustenance distributed by the specter, yet none of them displayed any response after consuming it. Sung-un initially conjectured that the sustenance could harbor a lethal toxin, but the official promptly dismissed that notion. The specter's fare was entirely non-toxic. In reality, each portion was therapeutic. The provisions within the container could address anemia, facilitate digestion, alleviate discomfort, diminish fever, and halt diarrhea. Every benefit corresponded precisely with the health issues of the employee who obtained it. Even the guild's research division was unable to clarify how commonplace sustenance exhibited such potent therapeutic qualities, complicating matters further for Sung-un. Consequently, Ghost was able to not only recognize an individual's physical state, but also produce items that could directly alleviate their symptoms. More significantly, he possessed exceptional talent in camouflaging himself, enabling him to evade the guild's stringent safeguards and navigate effortlessly through the exhibition galleries. The anthropomorphic creature, was presumably a remarkably elevated being. The spokesperson clarified that the very kindness he has extended to us is precisely what renders this situation so intricate. If he merely lost control, the circumstances would be significantly easier to navigate. They were unable to either contain the specter or ascertain if he could be enlisted. Moreover, at times, the benevolence presented by a dungeon society proved to be far more daunting than overt animosity. Numerous years prior, various countries had collectively dispatched a diplomatic envoy to engage with a society from an alternate dimension. However, each individual of that envoy returned unscathed and well, albeit bizarrely altered. The inhabitants of that society regarded human physiques as ineffective. Thus, in what they perceived as benevolence, they re-engineered the forms of the entire envoy. Ultimately, creatures remained creatures. All dungeon beings were formally designated as unequivocal adversaries, and any attempt to confront this phantom would probably transform into an exceedingly arduous conflict. Sung-un, file away the papers. Allow me to handle this issue. Circumstances of this nature are my forte. The official promptly expressed gratitude. We are lucky to have you on board. At that moment, the official recalled one additional crucial aspect. The peculiar events commenced on the precise day the guildmaster acquired the portrait of Kago. Sung-un became paralyzed the instant he listened to that. Their guildmaster was a fervent accumulator who occasionally obtained hundreds of new possessions in just one day. The media would announce his acquisition of a single artifact, only for him to acquire an additional 12 pieces a few hours thereafter. 2 hours later, his assortment could increase by an additional 10 to 20 pieces. He likely possessed thousands of artworks by himself, and acquiring an additional 30 to 50 in a single day was entirely ordinary for him. Nevertheless, the official asserted that the entire situation commenced when the portrait of Kago was introduced into the gallery. However, only the divine is aware of how many additional artworks were obtained on that identical day. The notion of probing each and every one rendered Sung-un utterly paralyzed. He gradually extracted a lollipop from his pocket and constantly affirmed to himself that he would never put in extra hours. However, without additional hours, there was no feasible method for him to examine such a vast quantity of artworks in the near future. The clock approached 4:29 in the early hours of the morning. Sung-un had previously devoted the whole night observing the exhibition. Suddenly, a human silhouette materialized before him. Sung-un silently watched from the shadows. The silhouette donned a dark robe, possessed ebony hair, traversed without footwear, and towered at approximately 6 feet. Flawlessly aligning with every aspect described in the accounts, the apparition emerged solely at dawn when virtually no personnel were present, indicating a heightened awareness of being observed. His actions could also be confined by specific circumstances or regulations. In the meantime, Go faintly perceived that someone was observing him, while Sung-un deduced that despite its human semblance, the spirit could be a highly crafty creature. The apparition did not adhere to any consistent manifestation timetable, so Sung-un had not anticipated finding him so swiftly. He promptly initiated his ability, ambient sound enhancement, and magnified each surrounding sound by a factor of 100. In the following instant, distinct noises penetrated his earpiece. The specter's strides were remarkably subtle, yet they undeniably persisted. They resembled strands of grass, softly caressing one another. There's nothing quite like the strides of a 6-foot-tall grown man. An unexpected notion surfaced in Sung-un's thoughts. Was this anthropomorphic creature genuinely appreciating the artwork displayed on the wall? The relic exhibited on this level was exceedingly perilous. Contacting the incorrect item could unleash uncontrollable turmoil. It is possible that the apparition was a sentient humanoid being, as it solely examined the artifacts without making contact. However, Sung-un was unable to discern if the entity truly valued the art or was merely idly passing the hours. Or perhaps he was seeking something valuable, as his gestures unmistakably indicated that he was in pursuit of a particular item. At that moment, Go abruptly pivoted and met the gaze of Sung-un, who was concealed in the darkness. Sung-un was taken aback. The apparition had been aware of his presence from the very beginning. In the ensuing instant, shadows entirely engulfed his sight. Who precisely was this individual? Why was Sung-un unable to perceive his visage? What caused the perpetual void of obscurity? Just one fleeting glance had rendered him utterly sightless. Amidst that obscurity, Sung-un faintly discerned a shadowy figure akin to a colossal eye, yet he was unable to grasp its true nature. It appeared resplendently luminous, yet boundlessly obscure, akin to a tremendous entity that all beings would inherently dread and venerate. The immense strain was so powerful that Sung-un felt as if he were gasping for breath. In the following instant, everything reverted to its usual state, yet the apparition had entirely vanished. Sung-un swiftly recognized that the apparition could be trying to flee. He forsook his concealment and swiftly pursued him. Drawing upon the silhouette he had observed and the feeling from their fleeting encounter, Sung-un had already deduced the origin of the ghost's painting. He quickly located it. The individual depicted in the painting appeared strikingly similar to the specter he had recently met. Sung-un emitted a soft chuckle. He found it hard to fathom that the specter had merely concealed itself within the artwork. This whole scenario was utterly absurd, and Sung-un could only wish that he had not displeased it. Thus, the inaugural day of his inquiry came to a close. Jae-oh was just as mouthless upon his return to the illustrated realm. The meeting had almost terrified him to his core. He could not comprehend why an individual had been clandestinely concealing themselves and observing him. The man must have been delusional. However, upon reflection, Jae-oh pondered if the man had concealed himself due to a genuine fear of him. Each of the other staff members promptly fled at the sight of Jae-oh, hindering him from conversing with any of them. However, this interaction had appeared distinct. This occasion, Jae-oh was the individual who appeared to have fled in terror. To avert the escalation of the misconception, he had to conduct himself as an entirely innocuous depiction. At that moment, a rabbit with 3 eyes bounded toward Jae-oh. Jae-oh sensed that the individual from earlier would eventually come back. As he extended his hand to stroke the bunny, it abruptly darted off despite having been calmly settled on his lap just moments prior. Upon reflection, Jae-oh realized that the petite creatures frequently drew near to him, yet they consistently darted away whenever he attempted to reach out to them. He genuinely desired to have a companion animal that he could embrace as often as he pleased. Jae-oh glanced at his studio and resolved to create one himself. The following day swiftly came, and Sung-un continued his inquiry. He reverted to the depiction of Seo Jae-oh, although he was far from as composed as he had been the day before. Sung-un stood in front of the portrait for over 2 hours without noticing anything out of the ordinary. Given the events of the previous day, it appeared that the figure within the painting had escaped upon realizing his presence. And all that Sung-un had encountered demonstrated that this depiction was far from an ordinary beast. From this point forward, he was required to recognize and adhere to its regulations. Even more disquieting, the longer he gazed at the likeness, the more he sensed shadows enveloping him. The prior evening had instilled fear in him. Merely being in the presence of those gaze had nearly exhausted all his vigor. However, among the creatures that emerged on Earth following the Great Cataclysm, certain ones could only be vanquished once humanity comprehended their narratives. Even at that point, triumph on the initial incursion was never assured. This was the reason humanity needed to examine them and seek methods to either coexist with them or combat them. At that moment, Jae-oh's gaze shifted within the artwork. "Would you like to converse with me? You have been lingering there for hours." Sung-un promptly acquiesced. "Indeed, I would greatly appreciate the opportunity to converse with you." Jae-oh had ultimately voiced his thoughts since the depicted realm conveyed to him that Seo-un represented no danger, suggesting he could genuinely be a benevolent individual. Jae-oh was profoundly touched by Seo-un's genuine nature and ultimately resolved to engage in a meaningful dialogue with him. He was prepared to converse with this alleged spirit investigator, despite the fact that they had startled one another during their initial meeting. Yet, even when confronted by a conversing portrait such as Jae-oh, Sung-un displayed no trepidation. He even expressed his regret initially. "I sincerely regret what transpired yesterday." However, that response was rational. In a time when individuals frequently battled creatures as colossal as buildings, a conversing portrait was scarcely the most bizarre occurrence imaginable. Jae-oh was convinced that Sung-un was a decent individual, hence he informed him that there was no requirement to express remorse. He subsequently inquired of Sung-un regarding his name. Melody-un was rendered voiceless. Their dialogue had already fallen into the precise routine outlined by the other observers. In contemporary society, disclosing one's genuine name might be profoundly perilous in any situation, as names constitute the most crucial component in agreements that tether the spirit. Should the portrait discover his genuine identity, it could potentially compel him into a malevolent agreement. However, considering the principles principles Jio had exhibited thus far, Song. It is undeniable that the painting could affect him merely by a name. My name is Ryu Song-un. Jio acknowledged with a nod. Your demeanor suggests that you have numerous inquiries. Someone Song-un grinned. Numerous doesn't even scratch the surface. I possess more questions than you could ever envision. When our gazes locked yesterday, was that shadowy form truly you? Please be honest with me. Jio inclined his head. Indeed, that was I. Song-un remained astounded. Does that imply you can exit the likeness? Jio acknowledged once more. Indeed, I can abandon the artwork. However, as their dialogue progressed, Jio slowly began to sense that something was amiss. What caused this individual named Song-un to appear so anxious? Song-un was fully aware that his response was evident. He just could not fathom why a non-human being such as Jio would disclose details about himself without any hesitation. He had never experienced anything of this nature previously. Jio composedly clarified, I have no motive to conceal it. You inquired, so it was only natural that I replied. Song-un tentatively posed the question, what if I had inquired with ill intentions? However, Jio's subsequent reply astonished him even further. That is not accurate. You are considerate and courteous, Song-un. This is precisely why I opted to converse with you. Is that response satisfactory? A chill perspiration formed on Song-un's brow. Did this depiction hold the power to discern and categorize individuals as virtuous or wicked? What might? What would occur if Jio encountered an individual he deemed malevolent? Would he confront them rather than simply disregarding them? Jio subsequently inquired, do you possess any additional questions? If I am aware of the response, I will share it with you. Song-un promptly responded, certainly, just allow me a moment to contemplate. An apparition has recently been roaming the gallery, treating visitors to delectable cuisine. Are you that specter? Jio was utterly astonished. Since when had he transformed into a specter, and why was he the final individual to discover this? An extended pause perplexed Song-un. Why was Jio delayed in responding to this specific inquiry? Jio finally uttered a word. Did you just refer to me as a specter? Song-un quickly understood that Jio was not fond of that characterization. Jio was so frustrated that he could only rest against the doorframe with one hand. He ultimately comprehended why each employee fled at the mere glimpse of him. They had all confused him for a specter. A speaking portrait might undoubtedly be confused with something supernatural. However, Jio firmly held the conviction that he ought not to be referred to as a specter. Ultimately, he had never perished, and he communicated that reality unequivocally to Song-un. However, from Song-un's viewpoint, Jio appeared to have inhabited the painting since his inception. Song-un had also been pondering the reason behind Jio's continual meandering through the exhibition. In reality, Jio had merely been attempting to comprehend his surroundings. He had abruptly found himself integrated into a masterpiece and then relocated to this strange location. The uncommon pieces of art showcased throughout the exhibition had also piqued his curiosity. Jio was fascinated by the individuals employed there, their lifestyles, their identities, and their preferences. Even in a realm that had entirely transformed, anyone experiencing solitude would instinctively desire companionship for conversation. A certain degree of social engagement was essential for existence. Jio had no desire to be bound to a post and set ablaze. Melody-un was completely at a loss for how to react. Jio discussed his fascination with human existence in such a flat manner that he resembled the other creatures examining humanity almost indistinguishably. Jio subsequently clarified that he regarded Song-un as courteous and did not think he was an ill-natured individual. Song-un beamed, it appears you have a preference for courteous individuals. However, Jio clarified that he was merely too daunted to engage with their superior and considered the regular employees far more accessible. Jio experienced social apprehension, whereas the guildmaster was an extraordinarily loquacious individual. The gentleman spoke so extensively that Jio was left uncertain on how to reply. Song-un ultimately grasped the complete scenario. The guildmaster's exuberance and extroverted nature had intimidated this despondent introvert to the point of silencing him. The revelation caused Song-un to feel an urge to chuckle. It's hardly surprising that the guildmaster offered no valuable insights during the transfer of the artwork. The portrait deemed him impolite and outright declined to engage in conversation. The leader of the guild had instigated this situation. Song-un had consistently anticipated that his demeanor demeanor would ultimately lead to complications. Our guild leader can be quite unconventional, so I extend my apologies on his account. Jayo reassured him that it was acceptable, as he could sense that the guildmaster was not malicious. From that reply, Song-un inferred that Jayo would not turn aggressive towards an individual who was not malevolent, even if that individual acted discourteously. Yet Jayo had penetrated the facade of an S-rank hunter, much like their guildmaster, all while maintaining an air of complete calmness. Just how formidable was his genuine strength? Jayo subsequently inquired, "Do you possess any further inquiries?" Song-un promptly responded, "The eyes of the portrait are typically shut. Are you still able to observe us when they are closed? Have you been gazing at us from within the artwork all along, even?" As he inquired, Song-un persisted in contemplating what Jayo genuinely sought from his ongoing discussions with humans. Jayo clarified that he wasn't precisely scrutinizing them. It resembled more the experience of gazing through a bus window while journeying into the city, observing the landscape glide by. The painting only revealed its eyes when Jayo deliberately interacted with the external realm. He had verified this himself with a mirror at the Scorched Academy. During all other instances, the painting's eyes stayed shut. This enabled him to view the exterior securely. From Jayo's standpoint, the individuals outside merely seemed like shifting visuals within his scope, which he found quite fascinating. The clarification rendered Song-un utterly astonished. His demeanor noticeably altered. A frigid shiver gradually crept down his spine. Jayo expressed that an additional artwork resided within his own realm and revealed the exterior to him. From Jayo's viewpoint, he was not the one confined within a canvas. Rather, the individuals beyond were the dynamic entities portrayed within his boundaries. The idea was astonishing yet not ungraspable. What astonished Song-un even further was how incredibly uncomplicated Jayo continued to be. Jayo clarified that he was merely attempting to be courteous. Ultimately, as a member of humanity, was he not expected to engage with others with politeness? Song-un beamed genuinely. This had undoubtedly been a delightful dialogue. Consequently, the second day of examining the artwork concluded. The subsequent morning swiftly approached at 9 o'clock. Song-un approached the guild leader and cautioned him that the painting was highly perilous. However, the guild leader leisurely sipped his tea. "Ben, enlighten me. What precisely renders this painting so hazardous?" Song-un disclosed that the depiction was entirely dissimilar to any creature they had previously faced. It was exceedingly generous. More significantly, Jayo truly regarded himself as human, despite Song-un's conviction that he was evidently an unknown creature. Song-un was unable to ascertain whether Jayo genuinely thought he was human or was fervently attempting to persuade himself. A being of that nature would typically seem innocuous. However, if something were to go awry, the repercussions could be disastrous. Jayo adhered to his own ethical principles and evaluated others based on his individual criteria. Song-un struggled to envision how he would respond to someone he deemed malevolent. For that reason, Song-un suggested relocating Jayo to the Hunter Association as a subject for investigation. However, it was highly unlikely that the guildmaster would consent to this. Instead, the guildmaster became progressively more enthusiastic and referred to Jayo as an extraordinarily delicate masterpiece. "Keep engaging with him, build rapport, and then also present me to him." Song-un quietly grumbled to himself. If he presented the guild leader, only for Jayo to disregard him once more, the atmosphere would become excruciatingly uncomfortable. He had to ascertain what Jayo genuinely preferred first. It was quite an intimate appeal, yet Song-un promptly agreed to it. Examining the likeness was already part of his duties, so he would have proceeded regardless of the guild leader's request. The guild leader pondered why all his staff were so aloof and distant, as the reality was that he would never enlist anyone who lacked poise and self-discipline. His fixation on amassing was not confined to artifacts. Even the gallery staff were included in his assemblage, and each individual had been meticulously chosen and instructed by him. Regardless of how humble an individual's hunter rank may be, the guild leader consistently upheld his criteria. If Jayo's mere existence was enough to overpower these formidable and proficient staff members and obscure their reasoning, then his spiritual status must be exceptionally elevated. Song-un ultimately consented to furnish periodic updates. Nevertheless, there were no analogous instances for juxtaposition, and a mere day or two of dialogue proved insufficient to ascertain Jayo's genuine character. The guild leader was indifferent. He He merely desired Song-un to connect him with Jae-oh when the chance presented itself, then waved him off. Based on his enthusiastic demeanor, Song-un nearly speculated if the man wished to witness the apocalypse. The third day of examining the portrait commenced promptly. Song-un came back to converse with Jae-oh, this time bringing along a chair, as standing for prolonged periods had become tiring. Once seated, he inquired if Jae-oh ever experienced feelings of loneliness. Jae-oh responded that he was neither desolate nor cut off from others. Song-un was unaware that Jae-oh possessed the ability to illustrate anything he desired. He initially expressed regret in the event that his subsequent inquiry might be objectionable. Typically, only personnel access this section to oversee the artwork, so I inferred that you sometimes abandon the portrait due to feelings of solitude. Jae-oh clarified that he actually favored locations devoid of others and did not experience loneliness whatsoever. Jae-oh had devoted the majority of his existence to conversing, thus he had perpetually envisioned a future in which he would never be compelled to articulate and would remain unconfined. In such an environment, he would be free from the concern of how others perceived him or the incessant anxiety regarding someone else's academic performance. He had perpetually envisioned discovering such a location, and now that aspiration had ultimately materialized. Song-un quickly perceived something unusual. What did Jae-oh imply by no longer being concerned about others' gazes or fretting over their academic performance? Had he genuinely been human in the past? Jae-oh regarded the inquiry as peculiar. I remain human at present. Acknowledging how disrespectful he had come off, Song-un swiftly expressed his regret. What Song-un genuinely intended to inquire was whether Jae-oh had previously been a regular human prior to becoming ensnared within the artwork. Jae-oh affirmed that he had. Nevertheless, upon entering this realm, Jae-oh perceived that those outside resembled figures within a canvas. Song-un felt he had finally grasped the concept, as anthropomorphic creatures were typically categorized into two distinct varieties. The initial category comprised beings that originated as monsters and ultimately transformed into human shapes. The second category comprised erstwhile humans who forfeited their original shapes and ultimately evolved into beasts. Song-un determined that Jae-oh must fit into the second classification. It's no surprise he persisted in claiming his humanity. That background also rendered him even more enigmatic and captivating. Creatures that preserved recollections of their human existence were often overwhelmed by intense negative feelings. However, based on the depiction, Jae-oh consistently seemed exceptionally composed. However, it was not a soothing or reassuring tranquility. It resembled more the hush of a memorial. It was the stillness that ensued after a loss, as if Jae-oh had already come to terms with the absence of something within him. Song-un then inquired if Jae-oh ever experienced tedium within the illustrated realm. Jae-oh responded that he occasionally did, but generally did not. This was due to the fact that he typically devoted his time to consuming food. The term consuming instantly baffled Song-un. Jae-oh elucidated that he had a passion for cuisine, which only perplexed Song-un even more. Did a depiction genuinely signify consumption? Jae-oh's apathetic demeanor did not mirror the countenance of a person who relished cuisine. Song-un could merely wish that the nourishment he consumed was not of human origin, assuming his forthcoming inquiry could be considered impolite, so Song-un expressed his apologies once more before inquiring about Jae-oh's usual meals. Jae-oh pondered thoughtfully and elaborated that he consumed a variety of foods. He individually collected and arranged a variety of components. Subsequently, he prepared them utilizing his personal culinary utensils. Every dish he created was merely cuisine he had relished in the past. Jae-oh was merely an average individual, thus he could not comprehend why Song-un was posed such an odd inquiry. Un became utterly quiet. In some way, the more Jae-oh elaborated on these commonplace behaviors, the more inhuman he appeared. Jae-oh ultimately started to grasp the genuine concerns that Song-un was facing. He elucidated the guidelines of the depiction. The primary guideline dictated that anything he illustrated within the artwork would materialize into reality. The secondary guideline stated that he could engage with the external realm via the frame suspended from the tree. The tertiary guideline asserted that the woodland operated as a wholly distinct domain with a fully autonomous, self-sustaining ecosystem. Jae-oh inquired if Song-un was intrigued by what he might achieve within the painting. In reality, Jae-oh was just as inquisitive. If their roles were inverted, Jae-oh would equally desire to learn all there is about the illustrated realm. He too had started to ponder the extent to which the painting painting's powers could reach. If he depicted something extraordinary on his canvas, that masterpiece could not only materialize, but also assimilate into existence and persist in evolving independently. Jae-oh opted to carry out a trial, but he required Song-eun's assistance. He elucidated that he still possessed methods to amuse himself within the painting. Song-eun inquired with interest, what sorts of methods? Jae-oh responded, maybe you can assist me with a matter and offer me some amusement, a melody. Un grew increasingly perplexed. What precisely do you mean by amusement? Jae-oh requested him to sketch an apple directly onto the portrait. Song-eun hesitated to alter the artwork so nonchalantly, as it belonged to the guild leader who was also his superior. Jae-oh reassured him that there was no cause for concern, insisting that rendering a solitary apple should be quite manageable. After pausing, Song-eun gradually unlatched the gear container he had brought along. Yet he continued to find it challenging to start. Modifying such a precious piece of art without authorization felt profoundly unsettling. As Jae-oh observed him extracting art supplies from the case, he pondered if Song-eun had likewise pursued studies in artistry. In truth, Song-eun merely possessed a tendency to bring along as many potentially advantageous implements as feasible. Nobody could predict what might occur within this exhibition, so being equipped for every eventuality was consistently the wisest option. Song-eun found himself contemplating what actions he might have taken had he not brought along any artistic materials that day. Soon after, he completed sketching the apple, despite its rather unattractive appearance. As a skilled artist, Jae-oh candidly expressed to him that the apple was not rendered very effectively. Nevertheless, he expressed his gratitude to Song-eun and extended his hand to draw the adorned apple straight into his realm. The view rendered Song-eun utterly astonished. What transpired next fractured his perception of reality. The painting, which had formerly only blinked its eyes, abruptly animated its whole form and commenced devouring the apple. Song-eun could barely fathom what he was witnessing. Jae-oh had genuinely taken a substantial chunk out of the apple that Song-eun had just illustrated. Song-eun was astounded. The figure within the artwork had genuinely consumed an apple, fashioned from his rudimentary sketch. An innumerable array of hypotheses and potentialities swiftly inundated his thoughts. Prior to, as Song-eun was able to arrange his thoughts, an even more astonishing event occurred. Jae-oh not only consumed the apple, but also lauded its delectable taste and delightful fragrance. Song-eun had merely illustrated it with inexpensive pigments, yet the depiction had inexplicably imparted a genuine flavor and aroma to the apple. Jae-oh clarified, I am merely a commonplace individual residing within a canvas. By that same rationale, I can achieve numerous feats in this realm. Whenever I lack the motivation to prepare food, I could just sketch a finished dish and consume it. Melody. Un was utterly astonished, for no typical individual could possibly accomplish such a feat. Jae-oh inquired, do you not consider my talent intriguing? Song-eun was completely at a loss for how to react. Jae-oh subsequently declared his intention to thank him for illustrating the apple. Song-eun was utterly perplexed. What precisely do you mean by recompense this time? Jae-oh regarded Song-eun as exceptionally gracious for accommodating an unusual portrait that had unexpectedly requested an apple. As Song-eun had sketched an apple for him, Jae-oh instinctively wished to reciprocate by illustrating a present for Song-eun. Jae-oh recollected the precious stones he had sketched while probing the boundaries of his abilities soon after emerging within the portrait. As he pulverized those precious stones into hues and employed them for his artwork, the colors and creations appeared to spring to life. If this realm could generate warm human forms, then virtually anything appeared achievable. Jae-oh yearned to uncover the consequences of his abilities impacting the reality beyond the confines. He went on to trace a jewel along the perimeter of the border. Yet, as soon as he completed it, the system provided an alert. Due to this illustration's disruption of the outside world, the capability would undergo a 1-week cooldown period. Nevertheless, the gemstone sufficiently compensated Song-eun for the apple. The precious stone gradually slipped out of the setting. Song-eun was utterly astonished. A chill perspiration enveloped his form as he delicately cradled the gem in both hands. Jae-oh clarified, this is your prize, I appreciate the apple. The precious stone exhibited a crystalline formation that Song-eun had never encountered previously. Nevertheless, Jae-oh had fashioned it solely through the medium of painting. It was astounding. Song-eun was unable to to identify the type of precious stone it was. Jio responded, I am uncertain as well. I merely adorned it with colors. Yet it surely originated from far beneath the surface of the Earth, where it rested in temperatures akin to those of the planet's core. It may still retain this heat, for an old companion crossed my mind as I depicted it. Receiving that clarification sent an additional chill down Song-un's spine. He was now convinced that this depiction was far from a typical creature. Thus, the third day of the inquiry concluded. Upon returning to his residence, Song-un meticulously refined the gemstone, treating it as if it were a valuable relic. He subsequently presented it to the guild leader and recounted all that had transpired. Drawing from his insights, Song-un suggested a fresh avenue of thought, the origin. The source represented an extraordinary entity that presided over the cosmos, upheld equilibrium among realms, and defined their regulations. It could also be perceived as an ultimate framework, or perhaps the deity transcending all deities. The dungeons that encroached upon Earth 3 decades prior were recently established realms emerging from offshoots of the source. The creatures recognized by humankind originated within those dungeons. Common creatures emerged from dungeons, whereas offspring of the source were directly conceived from the source itself. Their beginnings and characteristics were entirely distinct, yet Jio seemed to fit into neither classification. The guild leader listened with increasing fascination. Song-un proceeded to elaborate that Jio possessed the power to generate living entities beyond his own existence, a capability that could redefine humanity's perception of life. Jio could conjure beings in any shape he envisioned, inclusive of avian creatures composed wholly of vibrant water. On the 6th day of the inquiry, Song-un arrived back at Jio as customary, only to find that the depiction had altered significantly. Multitudes of aquatic avians now populated the artwork. Jio presented them as his newfound family and expressed that cohabiting with them brought him joy. He had sketched numerous of these avians, and they now soared unrestrained across the illustrated realm. Melody. Unobserved everything firsthand. Did you craft each one of them? Did you individually illustrate every single bird? Jio acknowledged that he had. There were approximately 100 charming birds, and fortunately none of them possessed vocal cords. Otherwise, the racket would have been inconceivable. Occasionally, the aquatic birds congregated and coalesced into a modest lagoon. They even sought items to embellish their physiques, rendering them both charming and amusing. However, this portrayal only astonished Song-un even more. These aquatic fowls did not resemble mere illustrations. They resonated as sentient creatures with their own autonomous ideas. Song-un promptly inquired if the avians had souls. Only a soul could bestow genuine self-awareness upon an entity, and fabricating one was well beyond the abilities of any recognized creature. Jio was unaware of the solution. He had merely conjured the birds into being. Offspring of the origin typically possessed limited individual identities and were unable to express themselves like Jio, indicating that he undoubtedly did not fit into that classification either. Melody. Unspoke with gravity, you exist as a work of art, yet you retain full humanity and can even affect the outside world. I am unable to perceive any divine presence in you, thus you are not a deity. However, in a different context, you possess godlike qualities because you have brought forth authentic life through your artwork. You may possess the ability to endow existence with a purpose, a history, and a forthcoming. You might even have the potential to fashion genuine individuals. If you are capable of achieving all of this by yourself, then perhaps you might genuinely ascend to the deity of this realm. However, Jio harbored no inclination to pursue such endeavors. The notion of conjuring human lives struck him as profoundly unethical. It exceeded all expectations of the ordinary, yet Jio still did not regard himself as especially remarkable. His response bewildered Song-un, yet it was evident that you undeniably held that type of influence. Jio promptly interjected, "Please refrain from regarding me as a deity and do not perceive me in that manner. I am merely a typical individual." A tempest of skepticism surged within Song-un. Jio wielded such extraordinary abilities, yet still asserted that he was an average individual. Who could genuinely accept that? 2 hours later, Song-un reappeared in the guildmaster's office and inquired if he genuinely had no plans of relinquishing the portrait to the Hunter Association. The sole knowledge they presently held was the narrative that Jio had directly conveyed. Song-un had no understanding of the type of abilities he employed, employed, the elevation of his spiritual status, or the function he fulfilled in this realm. The guildmaster simply grinned, yet the expression in his gaze disclosed everything. He had undoubtedly transformed into one of Gio's most ardent supporters. Song-un persisted, "We are completely unaware of how a being like him could influence humanity. No institution on the planet is more suitably prepared to scrutinize this depiction than the Hunter Association." The guildmaster ultimately exhausted his forbearance. "Have you overlooked what I requested of you upon your employment? I have never been the type of individual who is concerned with peril or personal benefit. All the guildmaster desired was a masterpiece, not a formidable armament." He had established the Collector Guild with the singular aim of amassing additional artwork. Song-un was at a loss for words. His superior appeared astonishingly theatrical. The guildmaster addressed with gravity, "As an aficionado of art, I might hold a degree of pride. However, as a hunter, I harbor none whatsoever. No connoisseur anticipates a masterpiece to repel malevolence, avert calamity, or bestow enchanting dreams. An authentic collector is solely intrigued by the narrative embedded in a painting and desires to safeguard that narrative with their own hands." It was this conviction that led to Gio's artistic realm earning the guildmaster a 5-star security evaluation. However, upon reflecting on his dialogue with Gio and all he had observed that day, Song-un continued to experience profound discomfort. The painting's influence appeared to surpass anyone's dominion, prompting him to maintain that relinquishing it to the Hunter Association was the most secure choice. However, that proposal utterly infuriated the guildmaster. His amber gaze became frigid as he fixed his stare straight at Song-un. "Do you still fail to comprehend? We lack the authority to halt that painting. In light of all the information you conveyed today, he is undeniably the deity of that realm. All we can do is bide our time until the moment this depiction genuinely transforms into a divinity." The guildmaster had become utterly dedicated to Gio, and the rationale behind his substantial expenditure on the artwork was to ensure Gio fell under his guardianship. Gio may wield a force akin to a natural calamity, yet he was capable of interacting with humans. Even more significantly, he had demonstrated authentic benevolence towards humanity. For the guildmaster, this was nearly ineffable in its grandeur. Meeting Gio was an exceptional stroke of fortune and nothing less than a miracle. Regardless of what Gio's genuine identity may be, they could not be imprudent enough to squander that blessing. Song-un was astonished. "Was that genuinely the motive behind your acquisition of the artwork?" As soon as the painting was unveiled at a public sale, it was merely a question of time before others uncovered Gio's presence. That was the reason the guildmaster had acquired it initially, averting the potential for an irrevocable catastrophe as it changed hands among various proprietors. The guildmaster had come across innumerable bizarre and perilous entities. Thus, from his viewpoint, if Gio was convinced that he was a human being, then they merely had to regard him as an individual. Regardless what transpired, they needed to safeguard this invaluable wonder. Alternatively, even the guildmaster would sense that existence had become devoid of purpose. The guildmaster was also convinced that Gio was an exceptionally kind individual. Gio despised challenging circumstances, yet he never bore resentment towards anyone on account of them. An individual who declined to harbor animosity. Even those who brought him distress and the circumstances that unsettled him must have held an exceptionally tender spirit. Gio may not have been adept with language, yet he consistently exhibited politeness, respect, and kindness. He never imposed his own standards on others, and even feared that his behavior could potentially bring harm to someone. Song-un sensed that there was something amiss with this rationale. Given Gio's abilities, inflicting harm on a human ought to be even less consequential than an individual crushing an ant. How could he truly dread the prospect of causing injury to someone? The guildmaster continued to believe that Gio was mild-mannered. However, Song-un distinctly recalled that the guildmaster had never spoken a word to him. Thus, how could he possibly be aware? The guildmaster grinned. Anyone aspiring to govern a guild requires at least this degree of perception. A mere look should suffice to penetrate all facades. He further cautioned Song-un against delving too deeply into Gio's mindset, lest he bring about calamity. His sole duty was to persist in conversing with the portrait. He should occasionally bring Gio outdoors, as staying within the same gallery indefinitely would ultimately become exceedingly dull. Song-un inquired once more, "Guildmaster, are you truly earnest?" The guildmaster remained silent. He merely gestured with his hand, indicating that Song-un was free to depart. Song comprehended instantly, inclined with deference, and ready to depart. In his role as the planning officer of the Collector Guild, he had squandered an excessive amount of time fretting. What he genuinely needed was to have faith in the guildmaster's discernment. Song was confident in his intuition, for those eyes could detect aspects that typical individuals would overlook. The guildmaster beamed once more, assuring this depiction receives the utmost standard of assistance that the Collector Guild can furnish. I will bestow upon you the required authorization and financial resources. Upon receiving his directives, Song-un departed from the office. Once he stepped outside, a subtle flush surfaced on his cheeks as a wave of relief enveloped him. In reality, he had never wished to relinquish such a profoundly expressive being linked to the source to the Hunter Association. His previous suggestion had merely been an assessment of the guildmaster, and his guildmaster had not let him down. The organization's scholars frequently did little more than mistreat the creatures entrusted to them. Indeed, Song-un had previously worked as a horticulturist. A source entity referred to as a garden would select an individual to tend to it. That appointed custodian became a horticulturist, dedicating their passion and effort to nurturing the garden. The state of a garden directly influenced the challenge posed by its associated dungeons. Horticulturists held immense pride in their craft and possessed a profound love for their gardens, cultivating a strong fascination and fondness for the foundational entities that underpinned them. Upon departing from the guild, Song-un paused at a street cellar. The booth focused on pastries shaped like fish. He had arrived since Geo had indicated earlier that day that he appreciated them. By the moment Song-un observed what he was undertaking, he was already positioned before the stall. Exactly as the guildmaster had asserted, if Geo genuinely perceived himself as human. And if his courtesy and thoughtfulness stemmed from that conviction, then Song-un must exhaust all efforts to safeguard it. Following the purchase of the food, Song-un went back to Geo and inquired about his age. Geo replied that he was 29, then posed the identical question to Song-un. Song-un grinned uncomfortably and confessed that he had already reached the age of 33. Geo's. The age took him entirely by surprise. They hadn't anticipated you would be so youthful. Geo appeared somewhat affronted. Individuals frequently remark that I seem mature, but doesn't that response feel a bit painful? Song-un promptly clarified that he hadn't intended it in that manner. He merely hadn't anticipated a life recognized by the guildmaster and far surpassing what an average human could achieve to be under 30. Song-un even contemplated whether the age of 29 was yet another facet of Geo's misconception, although he would never voice that thought. Instead, Song-un merely stated, I genuinely didn't expect you to be younger than me. Geo replied earnestly, I have something to share with you as well. You may be 33, but you appear to be roughly 2 years younger than I do. The flattery caused Song-un to flush, prompting him to lift the sack of treats to conceal his lips. Receiving admiration from a likeness was an unexpectedly pleasurable encounter. As Song-un was the elder, Geo informed him that he could adopt a more relaxed manner of speaking from this point forward, and did not have to maintain such a formal tone. Song-un responded, then I shall no longer restrain myself. He presented a gift, saying, here, this is for you. Concurrently, he had commenced strategizing the optimal moment to take Geo outdoors. This marked the 17th day of the portrait inquiry. Seo-un elaborated that if the source were likened to a human organism, the gardens recognized by humankind would merely represent minute segments of it. They could be analogous to blood vessels, fingernails, a heart, or even an eye. Geo found Song-un's narratives enthralling, while Song-un regarded Geo with equal fascination. However, once Song-un was selected, tending to a garden turned into an exceedingly challenging obligation. Numerous horticulturists had even perished, resulting in hardly any moments for respite. Geo inquired of Song-un if tending to a garden was a duty that one was obligated to perform. Song-un clarified that it is not a matter of personal choice. Despite my role as a curator, I remain unable to relinquish my duties as a gardener. He then presented Geo with a seed, precisely what Geo had requested him to locate. However, as he transferred it, Song-un abruptly recognized that their hands had made contact. Geo's skin seemed remarkably similar to that of a genuine human, and this marked the first occasion Song-un had witnessed him extend his hand beyond the confines. Geo failed to comprehend why this was so astonishing. Surely this isn't already overwhelming for you to manage. Song-un was undeniably grappling with difficulties. For some inexplicable reason, his emotional barriers seemed particularly fragile that day. Nevertheless, the fleeting interaction stayed within the limits he could endure. Whenever Song-un shut his eyes, he envisioned boundless snow-laden peaks and ice formations. Their splendid expanse consistently mesmerized him. Possessing a garden of his own proved to be a delightful experience. Gio cast a look over his shoulder at the vibrant landscape he had left behind and started to grasp the significance of Sangming's words. Gio was truly content with his present existence, allowing him to empathize with Song-un's emotions. He subsequently unveiled a recently emerged species. Distinct from other aquatic birds, this small being was capable of producing sounds. Having someone comprehend his emotions brought Song-un true joy. Abruptly, a gentle rustle of noise caught his attention, and Song-un lifted his gaze. He locked eyes with Gio and inquired, "Have you ever thought about stepping outside? If you're open to it, I can guide you and reveal the wonders of the world." Status in Gio's thoughts rapidly ascended. He genuinely was a kind-hearted individual, concerned that Gio might feel uninterested and even suggesting to take him outdoors. The guildmaster had directed Song-un to formulate this suggestion just prior to this. It was not a trivial choice. They were still unaware of the portrait's genuine identity or how Gio might engage with reality upon entering it. However, the guildmaster had disregarded those apprehensions. He is free to depart at any moment, and we lack the means to prevent him. If an event is fated to occur, discovering the resolution in advance is more prudent. Song-un casually solicited Gio's perspective. "You are acquainted with contemporary society. If you step outside, I will direct you." Gio contemplated the proposal intently. Was it at last the moment for him to reintegrate into society? Ultimately, he did not decline. He merely inquired when they might depart. Gio subsequently commenced conversing with the recently emerged being. Where father faces numerous concerns to contemplate, ultimately, everyone beyond these walls is frightened of me. Each time Gio departed from the illustrated realm, the reality illustrated by the canvas materialized directly in existence. He surmised that there was a significant disparity between his genuine essence and what humanity was able to discern. To those outside, he must have seemed strikingly unnatural. Even as the staff observed him communicate, they appeared remarkably detached, as if confronting something utterly unfamiliar. It seemed as though they inhabited varying levels of clarity. The disparity was disconcerting, yet Gio remained unfazed. Having already consented to depart with Song-un, he would firsthand encounter this altered reality. Concluding his tasks, Gio let out an extensive exhale of relief. His modest vegetable patch was ultimately finished. Gio's grandmother frequently reminded him that those who do not labor shall not feast. He had consistently recalled those phrases. He comforted the tiny bird next to him. "Don't fret, just being charming is already your purpose. Therefore, I will share the produce I cultivate with you. Yet not surprised by your development to comprehend me. Given your warmth and distinctive hue compared to other aquatic birds, I ought to bestow upon you a name. How?" Concerning Golden Boy, the bird promptly exhibited a distinctly discontented demeanor. Gio's expression soured. "You don't appreciate such a magnificent name? You're courting disaster." However, after some contemplation, he had to concede that the name was indeed dreadful. "Your father occasionally utters nonsensical remarks, so I hope you can excuse me. Nevertheless, I have never witnessed a bird appear this indifferent. In that instance, I'll refer to you as Sweetheart. You bear a slight resemblance to Sweetheart, and the hue complements you flawlessly." The avian creature instantly became more vibrant upon hearing its new title, prompting Gio to formally designate it as Honey. "How kind of you to embrace the new name. You resemble your father quite a bit." Gio subsequently went back to his studio to complete a number of unfinished landscapes. He intended to relish a delightful night's rest after laboring diligently throughout the day. Thus he blended a new array of hues for depicting the sea. Gio merely aimed to complete the artwork as swiftly as feasible. His paintbrush glided incessantly over the canvas, yet, unbeknownst to him, the authentic sea had already emerged profoundly within the artwork, encompassing its own intricate ecosystem. Concurrently, the creation started to seek an analogous realm. It persistently surveyed various realms, dismissing each inappropriate dimension. Despite investigating numerous options, it was unable to discover a compatible one. Subsequently, the system ultimately provided an alert that a suitable dimension had been identified. At that moment, Gio had completed the artwork and exited the studio. Following his exit, the seascape unexpectedly emitted a dazzling radiance entirely. Oblivious to the events that had transpired, Gio was already resting peacefully in his slumber. Beyond his chamber, the aquatic avians persisted in their frolic, intertwining their forms into a miniature lagoon before reverting to their avian state. Geo slowly opened his eyes and realized that dawn had already broken. As soon as he became conscious, a system alert emerged, requiring his acknowledgement. Geo was completely unaware of what the system expected from him at such an early hour. The board showcased a fresh title, Inhaling Ocean. The compilation also included Animal Realm and Metropolis of Emptiness. Geo was astonished that the system had labeled the piece of art he finished the day before. Through creating a modest landscape, he had inadvertently unveiled an entirely novel realm. The display showcased numerous choices: aquatic respiration, spatial portal identified, suitable counterpart present, synchronization activated. At that moment, Honey drifted over and settled next to Geo. Geo pondered if this type of synchronization was genuinely secure for individuals. Nevertheless, it appeared remarkably intriguing. Perhaps the system had previously acknowledged his inadequacy in nomenclature and opted to rescind his naming rights. Yet Geo remained oblivious to what a suitable counterpart entailed or what synchronization truly encompassed. While he conversed with himself, an additional notification emerged, prompting him to access an elaborate clarification. Geo uncovered that synchronization served as a technique for effortlessly grasping unfamiliar dimensions. The system would scan the current entities within a chosen dimension and identify the one most suited to the target as a counterpart. With that individual's approval, Geo could temporarily employ their essence and physique as a conduit, enabling him to comprehend and navigate their realm with greater ease. Geo pondered thoughtfully. Did an individual become eligible merely due to having Geo in their name? That appeared excessively straightforward. If that was the sole criterion, the system would not have designated them as a suitable counterpart. It had likely screened applicants based on various concealed criteria, including their alignment rate and general suitability with Geo. Geo discovered the whole idea captivating. It appeared he would never experience ennui again. The notification indicated that the piece titled City of Nothingness lacked a matching dimension and was not documented. The system inquired if Geo desired to register it as a completely new dimension. Did that imply Geo had merely fashioned a realm that had never been present until now? Without a moment's pause, he opted for the enrollment choice. He could already perceive that his tranquil existence was on the verge of becoming tumultuous. However, that was acceptable. At the very least, he would never find himself feeling ennui again, and a thrilling life was intended to be lived. Should he decline to immerse himself in this novel endeavor, he would undoubtedly become so ennui-stricken that he might forfeit his sanity. The prior pop-up had served as a fresh alert regarding a discrepancy in resolution between the two parties. Geo resolved that issues encountered during the initial endeavor were entirely customary. Nothing ever proceeds without a hitch indefinitely. He accessed an additional system interface and chose the rectification procedure offered by the system. In the following instant, his entire chamber transformed into a shade of blue. Geo realized that Honey had vanished from his shoulder. Just where could he have been taken? He had traversed into Breathing Sea, a realm linked to Giovanni's cognitive universe. The apparatus seemed unexpectedly dependable. Nevertheless, Giovanni's mental landscape mirrored a medical facility and was filled with various healthcare devices. Just at that moment, an individual with golden locks emerged before Geo. At first sight, they appeared to be a female. However, their characteristics also appeared quite masculine. Even Geo was unable to ascertain their gender. The individual's visage momentarily bewildered him. Nevertheless, Geo maintained his principle of courtesy, so he extended a greeting to them. However, upon closer inspection, he discovered that this individual bore an uncanny resemblance to him. They beamed softly, nearly as though they had been anticipating Geo's arrival for an extended period. It's a delight to make your acquaintance. I am Giovanni from the Bartlin lineage. Geo reciprocated the introduction, yet he was left with one inquiry. Why did this matching counterpart resemble him so closely? Giovanni giggled quietly. We likely possess numerous other resemblances too. Geo swiftly gestured with his hands. Let's not extend things that far. I could never beam as softly as you do. Geo had struggled with smiling since his early years, leading others to frequently misinterpret him. His somber demeanor had even resulted in multiple perilous occurrences previously. At times, he was simply contemplating his next meal. Nevertheless, individuals continued to deride him for appearing brooding and formidable. Giovanni grinned. What a charming and sincere worry. You bring to mind the pupils I once instructed. Henceforth, you can acquire the ability to beam just like I do. Giovanni's remarks bewildered Gio. Could he genuinely harmonize with him? The alignment necessitated Giovanni's agreement initially. Gio inquired earnestly, "Once we align, I will assimilate your body and essence. Are you genuinely at ease with that? Wouldn't you be concerned? Do you loathe me or dread me? I would seize everything from you solely to investigate an alternate realm. That appears to be nothing short of pillaging." However, Giovanni did not perceive it as an act of theft since he had passed away ages ago. His spirit had ascended to the sun, while his corporeal form had already vanished. Technically, his physical form had never transformed into dust, nor had it been interred within the ground, as the sea had entirely engulfed his native land, leaving no ground where anyone could be interred. Listening to this engulfed Gio in profound sorrow. He was unable to comprehend how Giovanni could persist in smiling so softly after his entire country had been devoured. Gio sensed his eyes starting to ache as the impulse to weep surged within him. He perceived the topic was exceedingly weighty. They had merely recently encountered one another, yet they were already conversing about Giovanni's devastated native land. Giovanni merely requested him to pay attention. In the current era, the sole individuals left in his realm were likely aquatic beings concealing themselves in the abyssal waters. Their formerly expansive realm had diminished to the dimensions of a game board and morphed into a labyrinth overseen by unique regulations. The term dungeon instantly rendered Gio solemn. Sanlin had informed him that the alternate realms emerging concurrently with the Great Cataclysm were recognized by humanity as dungeons. That notion had never been present in Giovanni's realm, so he had been unaware of the terminology previously. Yet at that instant, Giovanni understood that he and Gio could be parallel beings from two distinct universes. The clarification merely puzzled Gio even more. Are we indeed identical individuals existing in two reflected iterations of the same reality? Giovanni promptly comforted him. "Do not be concerned, we are certainly not identical individuals. We are two entirely distinct spirits who serendipitously possess numerous remarkable commonalities." However, once the alignment was finalized, Giovanni's essence would blend with Gio's. This could be regarded as a type of revival or rebirth. Giovanni would integrate into Gio and persist in forming new recollections. In this manner, Giovanni would endure within the origin. Yet Gio remained unaware of the true nature of the source. Giovanni elucidated, "This may still be an alien notion to you, yet you are already encompassed within the source. You simply have not acknowledged it." Gio truly had been oblivious. Was his artistic realm a component of the source? All his understanding of it had been imparted by Sanlin, whom he had only recently encountered. Giovanni went on to clarify that no one was privy to the source's authentic name, principles, or essence. The source was merely a designation assigned to it by the inhabitants of Earth. Giovanni portrayed himself as nothing more than a modest spirit who would accompany Gio henceforth. However, before their complete unification, he had one appeal. "If feasible, could you care for the sun deity of my realm?" Gio gestured towards himself in astonishment. "You expect me to manage the sun deity from your realm? Are you being honest? I'm merely a common individual. How could I even contemplate undertaking such a task?" Giovanni confessed that he had previously entertained the very same notion while he was still alive. Unless a deity was the origin itself, the loss of every follower would ultimately lead to that deity being overlooked. The solar deity would not entirely vanish, yet as his offspring, Giovanni couldn't help but feel concern. Luckily, tending to the sun deity demanded no perilous tasks. Gio merely had to keep him in mind, converse with him from time to time, and harness his energy whenever required. As long as someone recalled his presence, the sun deity could endure eternally. As a clergyman shaped by sunlight, Giovanni vowed that this duty would not impose any significant strain on Gio. Gio had a general grasp of what Giovanni implied. It resembled providing companionship to a solitary senior, a task in which Gio excelled due to his consistent volunteer work since his university days. Giovanni ultimately unwound following Gio's response. Gio additionally inquired if there were any other deities Giovanni wished him to oversee. He was confident he could manage comparable tasks with relative ease. Initially, Gio believed this obligation could turn into a nuisance, but he no longer held that sentiment. For an individual who had dwelled in the remote heights of Gangwon province, offering a smile to an elder and providing companionship was far from challenging. Upon listening to Gio's elucidation, Giovanni ultimately uttered a name. Aria, she was the sole individual whom Giovanni could not cease fretting over. However, Gio was unaware of what Aria represented or who she could possibly be. Giovanni clarified that Aria had previously been his pupil. His last appeal was for Geo to conclude Arya's narrative. In the subsequent instant, the cognitive realm began to disintegrate, and Geo was transported back to the illustrated domain. Honey remained patiently awaiting his arrival. However, Honey swiftly perceived that there was something amiss with Geo. Simultaneously, the system presented two fresh missions: converse with the solar deity and the conclusion of the youthful sea nymph's tale. Honey displayed a melancholic demeanor. The avian creature was unaware of its progenitor's fate, yet it sensed that Geo was in distress. Geo withstood the agony and assured Honey that he was all right, though his body seemed as if it were being ripped to shreds. Whose suffering was this, and what was the reason for his awareness of it? The synchronization progress indicator persisted in loading on the system dashboard. In the subsequent instant, a myriad of unfamiliar feelings and recollections surged into Geo. These were all encounters that Giovanni had previously faced. In those moments, Giovanni consistently echoed the same phrases that Geo was now articulating. In the distant past, Giovanni possessed a pupil. That pupil inflicted upon him excruciating anguish. Yet regardless of how severe that anguish grew, Giovanni persisted in cherishing her as if she were his own offspring. He never lamented any of the encounters he had undergone. Indeed, he remains truly appreciative that he had previously had the opportunity to accompany that young one. In the interim, in a different location, an adult and a youngster entered simultaneously. The woman surveyed her surroundings and remarked, "This place is terrifying. There are stars all over." With a single notion, every lamp post in her vicinity dimmed. She even yearned to snuff out the moon and convert this locale into a realm composed entirely of sea. In another location, the leader of the Collector Guild was getting ready to release a new proclamation. He had dedicated numerous hours to incessantly refining it, yet still had not dispatched it. The monitor showcased a notification for staff members. An unsettling apparition-related disruption has recently generated turmoil within the organization. To avert any additional misunderstandings, all personnel must adhere to the following guidelines. Firstly, the individual clad in the dark robe is referred to as Geo. Secondly, Geo is a staff member designated to the early shift. Do not inquire into his genuine identity. Third, if Geo requests to swap names, disclose your name to him. Additionally, you might present Geo with gifts, but you are obliged to accept his reciprocated gift. After meticulously examining all the details, the guild leader ultimately dispatched the notification. He had to avert any conceivable issue beforehand. Unintentionally startling, the portrait would be catastrophic. The subsequent morning, the entire guild burst into turmoil. All staff members were informed of the notification. However, no one had previously encountered such an unusual array of office regulations. Some quickly speculated that the figure in the dark robe was the specter from the latest gossip. All were terrified, as he appeared unlike a true human being. The guild leader's unexpected declaration was completely baffling to the personnel. Thus, they merely ceased their attempts to comprehend it. All concurred on a single point: the figure in the dark robe was unquestionably not an average individual. However, as the proclamation required their collaboration, they were compelled to adhere to the guidelines. The staff were understandably anxious about what this behemoth could ultimately unleash, yet no one ventured to probe deeper, as acquiring more knowledge would merely result in extra effort. No. Regardless of how generous the guild's additional compensation for overtime might be, no one desired sufficient funds to undertake such a perilous obligation. To the personnel, Geo had begun obscuring her essence. The apparition was evidently linked to the painting located on the gallery's 5th subterranean level. As the guild leader had previously concluded that permitting Geo to roam unimpeded was secure, the staff merely had to adhere to the regulations and steer clear of jeopardizing their lives due to unwarranted inquisitiveness. Each individual assented following the elucidation. The logic was sound. Their guild leader had never erred in his decisions, so they merely needed to adhere to his directives. Some staff members remained anxious that the portrait could frighten them to death. Thus they wished that the silver-haired hunter would come to the gallery that day. They were unaware that Sang-yoon had already made an appearance, camouflaged as a regular security officer. Sang-yoon stepped into the guild leader's office and complimented him for choosing such compliant staff. All arrangements had been executed flawlessly. The guild leader chuckled. "I handpicked each individual myself. Naturally, there won't be any issues. The exhibition is now entirely set up. No one will interfere with the artwork, and we need not be concerned about him creating disturbances within the guild. That should avert complications within the Collectors Guild. However, Gio's existence was excessively overpowering. To avert the revelation of his genuine identity before the populace and avert a catastrophe, it was essential for the community to perceive Gio as merely a top-tier hunter. The guild leader found this challenging, as the unexpected emergence of an unfamiliar S-rank hunter would undoubtedly provoke a significant public response. Hunters are now garnering as much scrutiny as stars and icons, with national pride and formidable hunters reaching unprecedented heights. Once the information circulated, Gio's tale would swiftly become recognized throughout the entire nation. Sang Yoon was convinced that exposure would genuinely enhance the safety of the circumstances. The threat presented by an organization associated with the origin frequently relied on the magnitude of its narrative and impact. If they simplified Gio's narrative to a form comprehensible to humans and provided him with a plausible human persona, thereby making the circumstances more manageable. The guild leader did not fully grasp the clarification. However, Sang Yoon was a former horticulturist who had managed numerous crises. If he suggested this strategy, it was likely accurate. The leader of the guild finally declared, "Provided this doesn't turn into a bloodbath, I can manage any level of harm. My sole stipulation is that you ensure he has a good time." Sang Yoon was astonished. How could a guild leader nonchalantly declare, "As long as it doesn't turn into a bloodbath"? It appeared that Sang Yoon would have to stay close to Gio for the duration of the journey. Indeed, Sang Yoon had longed to reunite with Gio once more. He was convinced that this excursion would transform into an intriguing adventure, and he did not anticipate Gio to create any disruptions, as Gio had consistently acted like a model gentleman. That sentiment arose from each dialogue they had exchanged, although Sang Yoon was unable to articulate precisely how such profound confidence had developed. Before long, Gio exited the illustrated realm. The instant Sang Yoon laid eyes on him, he grew profoundly anxious. There was an unmistakable quality about Gio that appeared altered compared to the past. Gio spoke in a measured tone, "You have finally arrived." Sang Yoon promptly observed that even Gio's tone had transformed. The impeccably managed yet profoundly calming tone had vanished, accompanied by the immense strain generated by the disparity in their standings. Gio had anticipated that his existence in the real world would unsettle others, thus he had devised multiple strategies. Sang Yoon inquired with interest about his actions. Gio clarified, "Prior to stepping outside, I modified my appearance slightly to ensure others wouldn't be alarmed upon seeing me. Based on your response, it seems my effort was successful." 2 days after aligning with Giovanni, Gio's tone and behavior had experienced a significant change. He had discovered a suitable match and effectively secured Giovanni's approval. By persistently undertaking missions associated with Giovanni's realm, their integration rate would steadily rise. The integration advanced significantly quicker whenever Giovanni's character engaged. However, even while Giovanni stayed dormant, the integration rate persisted in gradually increasing independently. The recollections were tied to a life Gio had never lived, yet they now resembled glimpses from a prior existence gradually resurfacing within him. Giovanni's reminiscences and sentiments were gradually intertwining with Gio. He possessed a kind and tender spirit with a subtle allure capable of effortlessly enchanting anyone's heart. Giovanni was likewise a driven individual who dedicated himself to seeking tranquility. Yet beyond any lofty aspiration, he cherished the mundane moments shared with those he held dear. Giovanni was genuinely an individual who had elevated compassion to its utmost degree. The encounter seemed as if the dual portions of Gio's psyche were functioning independently. Giovanni's character would sporadically emerge, yet reverting was as effortless as clearing his nose. After the system implemented Giovanni as the resolution adjustment procedure, Gio's disposition and character started to consistently align with Giovanni's. Throughout the experience, Gio experienced a true sense of hunger for the first time in several years. He now required consistent rest and even had to cleanse himself and utilize the restroom as his usual physiological activities slowly resumed. With these modifications, he ought to seem entirely human in both physique and demeanor. However, Gio was presently famished and required to locate sustenance without delay. Sam strode forward and navigated him through the construction. He could scarcely fathom that his apprehensions had been unfounded from the outset. Gio had contemplated the circumstances with even greater diligence than he had. In order to shield the individuals around him from being overwhelmed by his immense force, Gio had intentionally diminished his own aura. For someone of his caliber, that was nearly tantamount to shattering all four appendages and inching along the earth. Sam dedicated the subsequent portion of the day guiding Gio through the exhibit and the Collector Guild's central office. When Gio inquisitively gestured toward a particular chamber, Sam swiftly cautioned him against entering, as it was the guildmaster's office. Aside from that, Gio engaged courteously and amicably with each staff member they met. Sam had initially feared that a careless individual might incite Gio. However, those apprehensions now appeared entirely unwarranted. Individuals frequently remarked that a mere 10 years was sufficient to entirely transform the globe. However, the realm of humanity now appeared even more remote and alien than it had during Gio's earlier fleeting excursion beyond the artwork. Nevertheless, Gio promptly faced a fresh dilemma. He experienced intense social anxiety and struggled significantly with conversing with unfamiliar individuals, particularly those who tend to be overly chatty. Following an extended hiatus, he at last entered contemporary human civilization. Yet all those surrounding him gazed with peculiar countenances. Almost everyone on the sidewalk responded in a similar manner. Sam had anticipated this. Even after concealing his presence, Gio continued to be the most prominent individual in any gathering. To ensure his safety, Sam swiftly instructed him to raise his hood and shield his visage. The pair subsequently readied themselves to board a train to a dining establishment. Enveloped by myriad advanced gadgets, Gio could merely appreciate the strides humanity had made. He had never envisioned that the globe could transform so profoundly in just a handful of decades. Sam advised him to utilize his card for the travel expense. Gio could likewise utilize the card to acquire any other item he desired, as it imposed no expenditure cap. Gio was perplexed as to why Sam would provide him with an unrestricted card. He had previously labored diligently for every single dollar, yet now he found himself able to expend as much as he desired. The contemporary payment techniques also astonished him. Finalizing a transaction demanded merely a tap of the card against a scanner. Upon entering the train, Gio gazed through the window at the imposing metropolis beneath and deemed the sight utterly breathtaking. Sam clarified that the technology was no longer regarded as intricate. The majority of individuals now perceived it as entirely commonplace. Nonetheless, certain individuals still regarded the ticket prices as excessively high and were unable to pay for public transit. Capitalism was evidently thriving, yet the disparity between the affluent and the impoverished appeared to be even more pronounced than in the past. The spacious train carriage was nearly devoid of occupants. Sam clarified that it was likely due to the fact that it was still early and the majority of individuals had not yet risen. Gio could no longer maintain his composure. It was nearly 9 o'clock in the morning, yet numerous individuals still hadn't risen for their jobs. What sort of working hours characterized this epoch? Reflecting on the past, Gio recognized that he had been an absolute corporate drudge who clocked in at 7 each morning. Had labor rights in his nation genuinely progressed to that extent? Nonetheless, irrespective of what hour individuals arose, they ultimately had to engage in work. Instead of reintegrating into society and becoming a captive of capitalism once more, it may be more fulfilling to persist as a conversing portrait. Given that it was presently winter and snow started to descend outside. At that moment, Sam recalled the aquatic-shaped treats he had earlier acquired for Gio. Gio recalled them too and acknowledged that he had nearly overlooked arranging a reciprocal present. Sam promptly clarified that he had not brought up the pastries because he anticipated nothing in exchange. If Gio wished to consume them, Sam could effortlessly accompany him to purchase a few. If fortune smiled upon them, they could possibly discover 1 or 2 merchants that day. Additionally, there were numerous other delectable street delicacies, including the side fish-shaped confections. The pair persisted in their conversation as they strolled, and the ambience nearly resembled a romantic outing. Sam acquainted Gio with an assortment of treats while posing numerous rather simplistic inquiries. He even inquired if Gio was familiar with what a fish cake was. Evidently, Sam still did not entirely perceive him as human. However, Gio comprehended, having resided within a painting for an extended period. From Sam's viewpoint, that approach was logical. Given that everyone perceived Gio as an unfamiliar figure, no one would scrutinize his lack of funds or contemporary understanding. Furthermore, Gio now possessed an unrestricted card and was eager to indulge in a meal while observing how affluent individuals utilized their finances. Sam unvowed to seek out delectable street cuisine, but grievances regarding the city's aesthetics had rendered food vendors progressively scarce, particularly during daylight hours. Urban inhabitants were likewise hesitant to undertake such challenging tasks. A solitary grievance could halt operations and potentially lead to a penalty. It appeared that contemporary society upheld a clear separation between city dwellers and those residing beyond the large metropolitan areas. Geo was perplexed as to why civilization had established such a structure. Sam was also at a loss for words to articulate it. He could merely concede that this was the way contemporary society operated, despite the fact that the system was profoundly disgraceful. Individuals were now divided based on their citizenship status. Those residing in prominent urban areas and employed as hunters or engaged in esteemed professions were typically regarded as elite citizens. Hunters designated as B or above were automatically granted first-class status, irrespective of their earnings or occupation, unless they turned into criminal red hunters. Individuals residing in second-tier cities were typically categorized as second-class citizens. Individuals residing in rural regions were typically categorized as third-class citizens. Certain destitute individuals residing in the transitional zones between cities and countryside were unable to acquire identification. Lacking formal documentation, they were regarded as third-rate citizens. Offenders, including red hunters, were categorized as fifth-tier citizens. They were no longer regarded as human beings and could effectively be eliminated on the spot. The issue was no longer confined to an expanding disparity in wealth. Compelled social division had ingrained itself into daily existence. Geo found it bewildering why individuals were segmented so rigidly, as such a phenomenon was absent in his time. Sam elucidated that the system was initially designed to establish protective barriers and allocate infrastructure. In today's era, a dungeon could materialize anywhere at any time. Certain creatures that endured the Great Cataclysm have also firmly established themselves on Earth. The instant he completed his speech, Geo glanced upward and beheld a creature soaring over the metropolis. The peril posed by these beings was the reason for the colossal fortifications encircling the cities. The walls themselves were fashioned from formidable substances, enabling them to endure the majority of assaults. Urban areas also housed law enforcement personnel and numerous hunters, enabling the swift resolution of most crises. However, those resources were scarce. In isolated areas, even a brief breach in safety could result in a loss of life. Sam had deliberately selected their present eatery due to its avoidance of monster meat in its cuisine. Beastly substances had infiltrated every aspect of civilization, ranging from sustenance to building. Pursuers, who were fundamentally living armaments, had entirely transformed human societal norms. Geo could scarcely fathom that the planet had transformed so utterly in just 31 years. At the very least, the barbecued meat before him retained its delightful flavor just as it had in previous times. Perhaps that recognizable taste remained the sole constant in this transformed reality. Following dining, Sam escorted Geo to numerous additional locations before they ultimately reached the banks of a brook. This was Chinjiechin. Even during the heart of winter, the region retained a mild climate as the city's horticultural division employed enchantment to manage the atmosphere akin to a conservatory. All individuals, with the exception of lower-tier citizens, adversarial persons, and perilous creatures, were permitted to enter without restriction. At that moment, Geo spotted a group of avians he had never encountered previously. Because they resembled tufts of cotton, individuals referred to them as cotton ball birds. After their eggs were cooked, lengthy strands could be retrieved and crafted into medicinal wraps. Similar to these avians, certain creatures have entirely shed their animosity toward humankind. This was the reason they were able to thrive harmoniously within the urban environment. As these species had evolved to live alongside humans, the officials had started to embrace them rather than expel them indiscriminately. Yet Geo swiftly observed an unusual occurrence. The cotton ball avians appeared to cherish him and promptly nudged their downy forms against him. Salmon then proposed, "The water is sufficiently warm to immerse your feet. There are barely any people nearby at the moment." Geo perceived no justification to decline. He promptly took off his footwear and gently submerged his feet into the soothing current. The experience was remarkably soothing. Moreover, the water possessed a unique aroma, unlike typical fresh water. Geo softly remarked, "This water is exquisite. It's so transparent and profound." Yet, at that precise instant, his visage started to transform. Sam was utterly astonished. Geo had sported ebony locks just moments ago, so why had it abruptly transformed into lengthy, golden tresses? Geo went on, "This water is akin to that of the ocean from that location. Why is it that I can detect the scent of the sea here? How peculiar. It almost seems as if that individual has come here too." As he spoke, he softly gathered water in his palms. A surge of panic surged within Sam. The circumstances had evidently gone beyond all his expectations. The individual in front of him exuded an extraordinary warmth and tenderness. However, he also emanated an undeniable aura of peril. Even the tone of his voice had taken on an atypically gentle quality. His visage, tone, and style of articulation had transformed entirely. Sam could merely speculate about the whereabouts of the authentic Geo. The man with golden locks then emitted a gentle, exquisite chuckle. Sam promptly eased his tension and inquired softly, "You are Geo, right?" He reiterated the inquiry with greater specificity. "Are you truly Geo?" The man with golden locks simply responded, "I am Geo." The energy emanating from him instilled terror throughout Sam's whole being. A little while later, Geo reverted to his former look. Sam handed him a hotel key card and informed him that dinner was arranged for 6:30. Following that, concluding his clarification, Sam hastily departed. As soon as he was out of Geo's view, his energy waned and he fell to the ground. Sam was utterly convinced that the blonde-haired individual he had just observed was no typical human being. Possibly, since he realized he was presently in Korea, Geo typically presented himself with his full name. This was the reason Moon had intentionally inquired if the altered individual was Geo. However, the golden-haired individual merely referred to himself as Geo and never verified that he was, in fact, Geo. The occurrences of the day rendered Sam unterrified and utterly drained. He had let down his defenses merely because Geo concealed his status and influence. Reflecting on it now, that choice had been astonishingly foolish. Regardless of how much Geo mirrored humanity, he could never genuinely be one of them. The manner in which the golden-haired individual interacted with the water resembled a mimicry of human actions. That was exactly what rendered the scene so terrifying. In the meantime, Geo positioned himself on his hotel balcony, gazing down at the metropolis beneath him. He had covertly taken honey outdoors, yet he couldn't allow anyone to uncover the bird or openly nourish it. Geo resolved to utilize the leftover syrup to create honey, a delightful treat once they returned to the illustrated realm. Unlike Moon, who was immersed in troubling reflections, found that Geo was not preoccupied with anything especially intricate. Moon glanced at the clock and determined that everything was still unfolding seamlessly. Although Geo may merely be emulating human behavior, he nonetheless retained his compassionate nature. As soon as Moon conceived that idea, yet another event transpired. While heading to dinner, Geo encountered water and uncontrollably reverted to Giovanni once more. Moon ultimately understood that contact with water appeared to activate Geo's metamorphosis into the golden-haired Giovanni. Henceforth, he would avoid bringing Geo close to any bodies of water. Moon swiftly readied himself to seize Geo and plunge into the water alongside him, as an unassuming, vulnerable operator remained on the vessel. However, before he could proceed, Geo halted him and reverted to his initial form. The spectacle rendered the driver utterly astonished. His expression was marked by bewilderment and tears of fright began to well up in his eyes. Geo failed to comprehend what had transpired as well. The vicinity had inexplicably emitted an aroma akin to home, prompting him to morph into Giovanni without conscious choice. Nevertheless, irrespective of the cause, Moon could not merely seize him and plunge into the water. Moon promptly expressed remorse for his hasty behavior, and Geo reassured him that it was acceptable. Moon subsequently inquired if Geo had an affection for the sea. If not, what could explain his inability to maintain his shape whenever he came into contact with water? The inquiry caused Geo to become immobilized. He had never anticipated Song Yun would pose a question of that nature. Song Yun clarified that aquatic creatures had triggered an increase in water levels across the nation. Consequently, urban areas built an extensive network of channels that permitted saltwater to surge inland. Yichen also encompassed seawater, which led Song Yun to believe that Geo had a particular fondness for the depths of the ocean. The urban canals indeed held a trace of ocean water, yet Gio merely gazed at him in bewilderment. Gio himself did not especially cherish the sea. However, he was convinced that Giovanni likely did. Gio refrained from vocalizing Giovanni's name, merely reiterating it quietly in his thoughts. His ambiguous response bewildered Song Yun even more. Shouldn't the typical reply have been either affirmative or negative? Gio subsequently inquired, "Are there sirens in this oceanic water too? I believe I can detect something recognizable." Those remarks instantly put Song Yun on high alert. Gio had also suggested this, indicating that he had come across mermaids elsewhere. What exactly was his relationship with the denizens of the ocean? Song Yun clarified that certain creatures manifested in mermaid-like shapes. Even if they were not classified as monsters, they might still be unique supernatural beings. Certain entities emerged from veneration, folklore, and mythos. Merely being recognized and trusted by humanity could enable them to materialize in a tangible form. Mythical beings like the sun deity or Apollo might manifest in the tangible realm and be designated by humankind as creatures of monstrosity. Yet, details regarding genuine mermaids were exceptionally uncommon, as nearly no one had ever observed one. Giovanni's phrases echoed in Gio's thoughts. Their realm had diminished to the scale of a game board, transforming into a labyrinth regulated by distinct regulations. He also recalled the system's two missions: converse with the sun deity and the conclusion of the Little Mermaid. At that moment, they ultimately reached their goal. Gio gazed upon a colossal eatery molded like a massive conch shell, adorned with an abundance of coral fragments. The eatery had been fashioned from the remnants of a moored dungeon. As Gio possessed scant knowledge regarding dungeons, he inquired of Song Yun to elucidate them. Song Yun stated that dungeons could typically be categorized into stationary dungeons, which stay in designated spots, and dynamic dungeons, which shift according to their own principles. Depending on their formation, they could further be classified as virtual, structure-oriented, or entry-type dungeons. Certain dungeons had remarkably precise triggering requirements, like stepping into a convenience store precisely at 9 p.m., or assembling a group of 10 men in their 30s at the identical spot. Gio considered those regulations utterly unjust. How could anyone foresee that a simple trip to a convenience store would entangle them in a dungeon? Song Yun concurred. Virtual dungeons were exceedingly scarce, yet they were challenging to identify and could result in significant devastation, positioning them as one of contemporary society's most daunting anxieties. Secured labyrinths typically manifested through the formation of landscapes that had not been present on the planet prior. The chamber ahead of them had been associated with culinary activities. An unremarkable cook who wasn't even a forager had inadvertently found himself ensnared within it. However, his cuisine profoundly touched the master of the dungeon, enabling him to overcome it successfully. The dungeon had been subdued nearly by chance, astonishing even the chef himself. Gio considered the tale peculiar yet surprisingly moving. Following the completion of the dungeon, the individual unlocked the chef class. Now at the age of 92, he continued to be actively engaged in the restaurant's kitchen. His body quivered upon hearing that. The culinary expert was already 92 yet still needed to labor. That seemed utterly draining. At his age, could he genuinely still manage strenuous walks? Song Yun observed his bewilderment and clarified, if you encountered him, you would assume he was merely in his 50s. Individuals who were awakened and ranked C or above underwent significantly decelerated aging. Gio genuinely wished to cease being astonished by this altered reality, yet the notion of an individual laboring in their 90s was utterly daunting. Song Yun further elucidated that when topography from an alternate dimension supplanted Earth's native scenery and persisted after the dungeon was resolved, while merely its regulations vanished, it transformed into a terrain-type dungeon. The concluding classification was entrance-style dungeons. Merely a portal materialized in the physical realm, and anyone who stepped through it would be conveyed to an alternate dimension to commence the raid. Gio grasped this classification instantly. It was nearly indistinguishable from embarking on a dungeon mission in a video game. Song Yun beamed and inquired, how is the cuisine? Does it please your palate? Gio beamed in agreement. It exceeds my preferences. It's utterly scrumptious. This dish evokes memories of dining with my pupils. As soon as he completed his statement, he reverted back to being Giovanni. Song Yun joyfully responded, if you relish it, I can bring you here frequently. However, midway through his remark, he realized something was amiss. Gio had abruptly reverted to the golden-haired figure once more. Where had the dark-haired Gio disappeared to? The sudden transformation also caught the notice of the other patrons. Song-yun was reluctant to stay in that location due to the multitude of onlookers, as human behavior could be significantly more intricate than that of monsters. He resolved to escort Geo to a different venue, Gyeongbokgung Palace, one of the most renowned attractions in Seoul. As soon as Geo detected the name Gyeongbokgung, he became motionless. Throughout his tenure as an educator, he had brought his pupils there numerous occasions. He pondered if those youngsters were still living and how they were coping in this entirely altered realm. The reflection overwhelmed Geo with sorrow. The blaze that day had been colossal, and evading it unscathed would have been virtually unfeasible. Following a full day with Sanggun, dusk quickly descended, and the pair entered a hanbok rental establishment. Song-yun opted for a refined hanbok, whereas Geo picked an ensemble for himself. Their presence drew continual stares from the other patrons, who were unable to refrain from appreciating how striking they both appeared. Every prior excursion Geo undertook to Gyeongbokgung had been an educational outing, thus he had never donned attire like this personally. Managing pupils who incessantly grumbled about their tedium had already drained all his vitality. He seldom found an opportunity to savor the journey, even though adorning his pupils in hanbok and capturing their images had proven to be unexpectedly enjoyable. Their stances were uncomfortable and delightfully embarrassing, yet those instances still possessed a distinctive sense of happiness. At that moment, numerous silhouettes gradually hovered above Geo's head, akin to meteorites traversing the nocturnal sky. An individual clarified, "Those are meteors. They are offspring of the origin." Sanggun had presumed that Geo would be aware of them, as offspring of the source resembled creatures from fables and myths. "This should be your initial encounter with them as well, am I right?" That was comprehensible, as offspring of the source infrequently emerged in bustling tourist regions. Geo softly reiterated the name, offspring of the origin, he recalled Sanggun, referencing analogous entities previously. Geo requested him to elaborate further. Sanggun had only touched upon the source in a cursory manner while conversing about horticulturists, and the idea was challenging to encapsulate. In straightforward language, the source might be regarded as the deity above all deities. It was the ultimate framework that regulated the cosmos, preserved equilibrium among realms, and defined their principles. Entities directly originating from it were referred to as offspring of the source. Some offspring of the source were categorized as integrated beings. They seemed human, yet their cognitive patterns were entirely distinct. They were fundamentally organic entities created to replicate particular notions. Offspring of the origin possessed remarkable talent in concealing their appearances, rendering their true forms unknown to all. Geo inquired with interest, "Are there others who cannot perceive them?" A few individuals nodded in agreement. Merely a select few could discern the offspring of the source. In yesteryear, humankind had been utterly incapable of perceiving them. However, subsequent to Earth coming under the sway of the source, labyrinths emerged, and the emergence of hunters revolutionized the planet's ecological system. That was the reason a limited group of individuals could now recognize offspring of the origin. Song-un bestowed upon him a beaming smile. "As you can observe, I am among those exceptional individuals." Geo could not comprehend why he appeared so self-satisfied. He could also observe them, which rendered him an intellect who had been roused through a depiction. Upon listening to Geo's sarcastic comment, Song-un shattered the beverage in his grasp. His demeanor rendered everything clear. He had once more categorized Geo as a creature. After all, wasn't it entirely natural for one beast to perceive another? At that moment, they perceived the noise of a struggle in close proximity. A man unexpectedly hit another individual with his hand, propelling him through the air. Initiating a confrontation in an environment such as this was exceedingly imprudent. The sentinels would likely expel them shortly. Simultaneously, a dialogue box materialized in front of Geo, set a benchmark for assessing their individual safety score. Mission reward, emblem. Geo had not anticipated a system challenge to emerge so abruptly. The nearby skirmish was swiftly quelled and the sentinels expelled both combatants. Geo meticulously scrutinized one of the individuals. He seemed to be a blameless casualty, so why had the sentinels apprehended him too? In the following moment, an evaluation interface emerged, showcasing the man's threat level. This system contrasted sharply with Geo's illustrated realm. The external environment assessed peril, whereas his domain gauged security. Most astonishingly, the apparently harmless individual held a 5-star threat assessment. Was it genuinely secure to allow someone so perilous to roam without restrictions? The man observed Gio scrutinizing him and pivoted around with intrigue. Gio ultimately recognized that he had gazed for an excessive duration and garnered the man's notice. At that moment, honey unexpectedly darted out of Gio's sleeve, surprising Seung-hoon, who was standing next to him. Gio swiftly tucked honey back into his sleeve and feigned that nothing had transpired. Seung-hoon fixed his gaze on him. Concealing it once more doesn't imply I didn't witness it. Seung-hoon abruptly recognized that the bird bore a resemblance to one of Gio's aquatic birds, with the exception that its entire form was golden. However, that was not the primary issue. Gio had introduced a being from the illustrated realm into the tangible world. Seung-hoon sensed that his entire existence was crumbling, as he was utterly unaware of how to convey this to the guildmaster. In the interim, the perilous individual had observed it all. His look directed at Gio slowly transformed into one that was ominous and menacing. He nonchalantly pivoted and strolled off. However, within, he had already designated Gio as a mark. Gio, too, perceived a menacing stare directed at him. A feeling of terror gripped Gio. Did that individual harbor animosity towards him? Maybe he ought to retreat to a secure location before the unfamiliar person incited conflict. Gio proposed heading back to the hotel. However, Seung-hoon appeared entirely oblivious to the menacing stare from before. Seung-hoon wished for him to stay outdoors a bit longer, while Gio aimed to purchase additional rice cakes prior to departing. 2.5 hours later, the threatening figure reappeared in close proximity. He was the identical individual who had been observing Gio, and he was intensely eager to uncover the identity of the cloaked individual. Under typical conditions, he would have faced Gio without delay. Yet, despite his visage concealed by the hood, Gio instilled in him a profound sense of dread. More significantly, Gio seemed to be acquainted with Seung-hoon, which exacerbated the man's frustration even more. There was evidently something amiss. The cloaked figure must have been a vigilant pursuer. When Gio evaluated him previously, the man sensed as though all of his hidden truths had been unveiled in a moment. That power was chilling. A significant occasion for the Order of the Sun was imminent. He had labored diligently to attain the title of priest, enabling him to personally assemble the platform for their ceremony. If that scoundrel uncovered his secret and alerted the Order, it would all be finished. Consequently, the clergyman made a reckless choice. He would eliminate Gio. At that moment, the clergyman spotted a gilded avian creature in proximity. He had never encountered a bird quite like it before, yet there was something about it that felt recognizable. Wasn't this the identical bird that appeared from the cloaked man's sleeve? Was the unfamiliar figure also a creature handler? The cleric found the predicament entertaining. Upon uncovering his secret, that scoundrel had remarked on sending a mere diminutive being to observe him. It was a quintessential error made by an unseasoned tracker. The clergyman resolved to seize the gilded avian and employ it to locate Gio. However, in the following moment, the cleric was unable to continue laughing. His hand glided directly through Honey's form and made contact with the crimson core gem concealed within. The moment the connection was established, an unfathomably intense burst of energy radiated outward in all directions. The clergyman instantly perceived an alarming power, vastly exceeding anything he could grasp. He was completely unaware of the unfolding situation then. An intolerable searing feeling engulfed his whole being. The heat persisted in escalating until his form utterly disintegrated. In the meantime, Gio was entirely oblivious to the events that had transpired. He only became aware that something was amiss when he abruptly observed that Honey was no longer present. Gio quickly rose and commenced a thorough search in every direction. An intense dread surged within him as he cried out fervently, "Please emerge. Cease your game of hide and seek with me. If you don't show up shortly, I will genuinely begin to weep."